Hello coder and welcome. In this tutorial, we'll be discussing what is components in Angular. So Angular component is the building block from which an Angular application is built. As you build application using Angular framework, the application you are building is going to contain a whole lot of components that you will be building, you'll be creating. So essentially, what the controls from buttons to image to everything that the user will be interacting with will be built using components. So if you are building an application, let's say you are building an accounting application, for example, so that application is going to contain a whole lot of components nested in between another component. Looking at this image is picked from the official website of Angular. Let's say we are building an accounting system. So let's say we have a base component called account setting component, and inside of this account setting, we might have a user profile component that displays the user profile, and inside of this account setting component, we also have another component called payments information component. And in between the user profile components, we might also have other components. From the profile picture, a component that handles just the profile picture, and a component that handles the bio of the user. So as you can see, when building an Angular application, you are going to be building a bunch of components nested between one another. So how do we create components in Angular? Before we dive into how to create component in Angular, it is important to know that for every component in Angular, you are expected to have three things. The number one is a class, a TypeScript class, So TypeScript is a programming language that we use in Angular. So you are going to, when creating a component, you are going to have a file that will contain a TypeScript code or TypeScript code. Number two, inside of this TypeScript file, you should have a selector. So selector determines how your components will be used. Then thirdly, a template. So templates, I'm keeping it short. This also has further explanation. Template determines what is visible or what will be visible to your user. So templates basically is the HTML codes that will be rendered on the client side. So typically, a component should have all of these. And lastly, a component should have a way of styling it. Let's call it style. So you have a TypeScript file where you put in all the logic that will handle the interaction in that component. Then you have a selector that determines how the components will be used. You have the templates that determines what will be rendered by the clients for the particular component you are creating, and you have a style. So the style determines how the HTML will be rendered on the client side. So these four basic things should be digested, and let's see how to follow this one after the other to manually create our components before we use Angular CLI to generate components. Continuing from our first application we created in the previous tutorial. So this is the folder structure of an Angular application based on Angular 18. So I'll be discussing the folder based on the one we are currently interacting with, so keep it straight. The src folder is where we have all our code. So most of the time you'll be spending most of your time writing code in between the src folder, and inside of this src folder we have an app folder. So this app folder is otherwise known as app components, so which is the base of your Angular application. So as you see, we have a bunch of code inside of this app component.html. What we have here is what we are currently seeing on in our browser displaying. So what we are doing before we tamper with what we have here, or to start with, let's clear this out. So if we clear this and wait for this to browse, then everything is gone. So to make sure that we have something here, let's put and put my name. I am Taufik. So now we have something, so that our page won't look empty. Now let's create a component manually. So create a component manually. Let's create a file over here. So click on file using VS Code, of course, and you can also right click to create a new file. Right click on the folder. So I'm creating the component inside app folder. Now new file, so I'm going to call it test.components.ts. so having components when naming your component file is a standard. It's not a must, but it is good. So don't forget what we are following here, a file that contains TypeScript code. So we already have a file for that. This is the name of our file .ts. So .ts is the extension for TypeScript code. Now let's create a class. Let's give it a name. Our component name is test components. Then this is how to create class in TypeScript. To make this a component, there is a decorator that indicates that a file is of components, and that decorator is known as components from Angular core. Now in the brackets, so what we have here, these three attributes that was mentioned initially are attributes or properties of this decorator as components. So let's start inserting them one after the other. So the selector that determines how our component is to be used, let's put that there. So let's say selector. So is CSS pattern, the CSS selector pattern. So let's say we are giving it test. So this, our component, whenever our component is to be used, all they have to do is mention the test in tag format, and our component will be rendered. So going back, so secondly, we have a template. Let's comma templates. Let's say an HTML I1. Sorry. So I'll copy what we have here and paste it here. Then the next thing is the style. Let's put a style also. Let's make it font weight, it's a bold, it's a color. So just a few style, and that is the basic attributes property of this selector. Now because this is based on Angular 18, to make it so we should have these attributes, standalone attributes, true. So if this is not based on Angular 18, a way for us to use to import our component is via ng module. So we're not talking about that for now. So adding this standalone attributes makes it quickly accessible and importable in other standalone components. Again, you don't have to understand fully all of this, just have the basic idea of what they are doing. So the more we do them, the better you understand. Now we have our components ready. So the next, if we look at it here, our app is now empty. So it is completely empty. Now let's make use of this our newly created component in this our app component that is currently showing on our browser. So open the TS of the app components, the TS app.component.ts here, and inside the imports, as you can see, it also has its own as component attribute. So think of the app component as the parent component for all your other components that you'll be creating in your Angular app. Now in between the import attributes, so let's import our components. Our component name is test components. So let's make it exportable. Export. Export components. Now our component is imported inside the app component. Now inside the app component.html, let's use our components. Remember our component tag, our component selector is test, so that is how we are going to use it. So let's say test. Now this is the selector for our component right here. So the moment we mention our tag here, the selector here, everything we have here will be rendered in this component. Let's confirm that if it is working. And voila, we have our components running and working. Now you will notice that we obviously cannot write a big web page, design our robust application. It won't be convenient doing it this way, inline this way, and also it won't be convenient doing our styling this way. There should be a better way, and of course there is a better way. Now the better way to all of these is to do separation of concern. So what if we can separate this in a separate file? We can have our templates, what will be rendered to our user in a separate file, and how we style what will be rendered in a separate file. And also we have this component to be standalone. We have a way to do that, and I don't want us to do it manually, so let's use our CLI power to generate an Angular component. So let's say ng generate components then the name of the component. So let's say demo, and let's click on enter. So as you can see, this generates a folder called demo, and inside of this folder we have a CSS, which is what we use to style what will be rendered to our user. We have an HTML file, which is what will be rendered to our user. We have a spec file, which is the file for for testing our components. And also finally we have the TS. The TS file contains the logic, how we handle user interaction with our HTML contents. So let's open it here. I'm going to open on the file. Okay. Now look at here. We have this HTML content, demo works. We have the styling. Let's do some quick styling here. Let's say color red, and we have our selector, the selector here. So it's the same thing as what we have, but instead of template that we have initially, is now template URL. Instead of styles that we have initially in test component, is now style URL. So that is the difference. And now our selector is app demo, so we can change it to what we want. So just like we use the test components, let's use the demo components, and let's use the demo tag, demo selector in app components. Let's go to our browser and see. And as you can see, this is functioning. And now we have two components. This is a separate component, a manual component, and this is an automatic component generated using Angular CLI schematics. That is that about us in this tutorial for how to generate an Angular component manually and automatically with CLI. If you have any question, don't forget to drop it, and gladly I will guide you further. See you in the next tutorial.